Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today, my name is Steve Shirley. I'll be your host for this session. So over the next 45 minutes, we're going to be looking at the relationship between supply chain assurance and cybersecurity. So cybersecurity plays a vital part in identifying and minimizing risk for supply chains. But how does cyber risk and business risk fit together? How involved should we be as cybersecurity practitioners? And what does good look like? These are some of the questions we're going to be tackling today, and I'm very delighted to be joined by two guests, which I'm going to introduce. So first we have Hayden Brooks, who is the CEO of Risk Ledger. Hayden was a cyber risk consultant for a Big Four consulting firm for a number of years, where he focused on supply chain assurance. And through that work, Hayden really got to see firsthand the friction between the inner workings of a complex supply chain assurance program. He realized that clients and suppliers could work better together, and the result is Risk Ledger, which is, in short, a security governance platform coupled with a secure social network that helps simplify the task, identify risks, and uncover potential vulnerabilities. So thank you so much for joining us, Hayden. I'm also joined by Michael Weng, who's a senior security consultant at WithSecure. So Michael has more than 2 decades experience in cybersecurity with a background in operational technology and industrial control systems. He's a blue teamer here at WithSecure. He specializes in architecture reviews, solution designs, incident response in OT, and he also helps companies develop robust OT and ICS strategies. So gents, thank you so much for joining me. We've got a lot to talk about today, and I want to get stuck in straight away. So let's start with the first question. Hayden, I'm going to go to you first. If I was to start a new company today and develop it from the ground up, why should I think about supply chain risk and supply chain cybersecurity?
Big question. So yeah, thank you for inviting me today. So to answer the question in brief, I think supply chain risks kind of take 2 forms. So firstly, there's kind of a data confidentiality risk, which is the more traditional one that we all know about. You have a breach in the supply chain and data's leaked. But more importantly, when you're starting a company, nowadays outsourcing has become a big thing, and outsourcing more critical functions of your company has become the norm. And that leads to a resiliency risk. So you might be starting a company, but then relying on other companies for your company to be able to operate. And that needs to be taken into account when you're starting a company, because obviously you're essentially outsourcing that responsibility to other people. And if they don't fulfill that responsibility, essentially your company can't operate. So it's a fairly mission critical risk for new companies to think about, especially with the emergence of technology and cloud as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Hayden. And Michael, what about your thoughts on this? Welcome to the chat. What would you like to chime in with?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Thank you for having me. Well, I agree with Hayden. It's actually more and more important that new startups are looking into the fact that the modern world and the use of technology provides a lot of positive means to expand and to grow, but it also introduces new risks, and hence supply chain is moving from the old, more traditional looking at raw materials and goods flowing into companies. Now it's also the fact that you're having your IT services sourced in, you're having all kinds of collaboration to do your daily processes and work, and that becomes more and more important, hence to cyber secure that part.
Absolutely.
I can probably add to that as well, that like a lot of domains in security, a lot of supply chain stuff relies on, for example, the procurement process being well-oiled and good, and us having good data to work off. And so when you're starting a company, if you can get those fundamental processes right, then essentially you're not going to be trying to retrofit or fix a lot of missing data when you do come to worrying about supply chain risk maybe at a later stage.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And there's obviously also the part that you're also, as you are relying on IT to carry a lot of the business processes, you may be developing your own applications. Hence, you might be relying on CI/CD, so internal development processes. They also become part of that supply chain risk picture, because you need to ensure that from your development environments to your testing to your production environments, that's also a supply chain. So it's important that everybody is on the same page and that you have clear definitions. When are we talking supply chain? Is it internal supply chain or external supply chains? That's also to confuse the picture.
Yeah, it comes up a lot with clients actually when we're chatting to them around. I think a lot of people don't realize they have three distinct supply chains almost in their company. They have their software supply chain if they're building software, which is almost a completely different problem, but it kind of like a Venn diagram overlaps slightly with what I would call their corporate supply chain, which is more your traditional kind of list of companies. And then thirdly, you may have a logistics supply chain as well. And logistics supply chains again is different because the risk profile there is the right goods not being at the right place at the right time, which is distinctly different to security kind of in your corporate supply chain, which is then different again to your software supply chain, where it's all about dependencies. So yeah, the more you dig into it, the more complex it becomes.
I think that's going to be a theme, isn't it, for today? It's such a huge topic, right? And we only have about 30 minutes of questions to kind of start to unpick. So we're going to do our best, and thanks guys for your thoughts. What I'd like to do actually is bring in our listeners. So everyone who's joining us, thank you so much for dialing in from all over the world. We've got a couple of poll questions because we'd really like to get your thoughts on this topic and have a bit more of an engaging discussion. So we actually have a poll question which I'd like to bring up, and you should be able to just answer this from the window that you're watching us talk in. So the first question I want to put to the audience is, how helpful is it to have complete transparency and open information sharing around cybersecurity incidents and threats throughout your supply chain? Now that, I don't know about what you guys think, but that might seem like a really obvious question initially, where you might be like, oh, it's really helpful to have information, but actually I think there's a bit more in that question to unpick. So what are your guys' thoughts on having that much information around this challenge? What are your thoughts whilst our audience are putting in their answers?
It's kind of the nirvana, I think, wanting that level of information. So I've always said that I think a much better way of doing cyber threat intelligence, and this almost is the basis for the future of Risk Ledger, is having a network of organizations all sharing that information amongst each other so that you can see the attacks coming in and be able to propagate that operational information amongst all of your peers so that you can all defend against those same attacks. I think the biggest challenge to that at the minute is traditionally when you've had a supply chain attack, typically procurement and lawyers will get involved and want to maybe switch supplier or look at potential other alternatives. And that disincentivizes the supplier from sharing anything that they could deem as almost risky to the contract they have with you. So there's probably some more deeper cultural issues there that mean we can't reach that nirvana yet. But I think the industry is moving in that direction for sure. And it's definitely helpful being able to share that information.
Yeah, and let me add to that, I mean, it then becomes evident that the procurement phase or the initial phases of setting up the security controls and also later the incident response processes, when you're dealing with other companies and have to have interfaces between the companies and the data, you might detect the attacks early on, but it also becomes important to have a clear set of agreements as to do the incident response, and especially the forensics can become challenging. It's talking about sharing information, and it's still we still have a way to go to reach the nirvana where we actually share openly, because it is still a lot of places considered well, this is our not so clean underwear, so we don't want to share it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Usually I throw the question back at clients as well. So I asked them, if you had two suppliers of the same security maturity, but one were telling you about the breaches they were having, and one wasn't, which supplier would you rather work with? And that's quite an interesting way of them thinking, okay, well, I'd rather hear about the breaches, which maybe then having tough conversations where you are talking about cancelling contracts with the suppliers isn't the way to incentivize that communication in a way.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's kind of what I was interested in, that question, that kind of what level of information is actually useful. Sometimes there's a difference between it's nice to know and actually how do you create value out of that information. So thanks for everyone who's added in their thoughts, kind of reflects what we've just been talking about, I think, which is always good to know. So I'm just looking at the clock, we're going to keep moving, we've got loads to cover today. So I'm going to get up our next question for our guests. So this is quite an interesting one as well. So how involved should we be as cybersecurity practitioners in the actual assessment of supply chain security risks and mitigations? You know, where does our responsibility end, and where does the responsibility of the business start? So let's throw that out into the mix. Maybe Michael, how about we come to you for that first, and then Hayden, you can jump in.
Yeah, well, I think it's important that we are involved in actually all three of the kind of supply chains that we identified, because even today the raw material flows into our companies, or the logistic flows basically, are also supported by smaller or larger parts of EDI or interfacing between companies. And as soon as you have data, electronic information flowing between companies, they're probably flowing across the internet, and there, of course, no doubt, cybersecurity becomes an issue, and it has to be controlled. So I think we need to be there. That being said, there are also specific, more physical world considerations that the business need to do, both about resilience and other stuff. But I think we're pretty important in the full life cycle, up and downstream.
Hey, what about your thoughts from your experience?
I'd 100% agree.
On the ground?
And so I think like the software supply chain and corporate supply chain are fairly well established, that security should have a huge amount of involvement in those. On the logistics side, interestingly, I was speaking to a prospect of ours where it was an oil and gas firm, and they had an attack where people were stealing canisters of oil essentially off the back of trucks. But combined with that, they were editing the ledgers at each one of the logistical kind of waypoints almost to remove those barrels as they were going. They're losing quite a lot of money from that. And it was only after that incident that actually security became involved in the logistic supply chain as well. So definitely should be involved across all three. In terms of who has responsibility for it, it's an interesting one, because fundamentally procurement always had responsibility for the supply chain and making sure the supply chain is healthy. But procurement aren't necessarily the subject matter experts within security. And so security have to act as almost an advisory function to that. But then ultimately the business has to own the risk. And the way I tell clients to set it up is, ideally, you want your security team to be responsible for doing the review and then advising the business on what the risk is. Then it's up to the business to say whether or not they're happy with that risk, because at the end of the day, they're the ones making the money. And if, for example, you say a supplier is hugely risky, but it's going to triple your revenue, that might be something that the business wants to accept. And it's not really security's kind of remit to make that decision on their behalf. So it's almost a shared responsibility across security, the business, and procurement, and any other kind of stakeholders. And that needs to all be predefined when you set up the program. So that's something that will be slightly different in each company that we speak to.
Yeah, and I think in that sense, supply chain security is not that different from all the other security disciplines that we do in cyber, because it's not as much, finding the controls and implementing and deploying. It's more having business involved and doing their assessments and actually evaluating how critical is this to the business resilience, and making them do the judgment, and then they point us in the right direction. I think that's a challenge also outside of supply chain, but it's that's everyday business.
And as a bit of a tangent there, I think a lot of security people don't like the supply chain work. And that's probably for two reasons. Firstly, it tends to be like a kind of a spreadsheet monkey type role, where you're stuck in front of spreadsheets just reviewing assessments kind of all day, every day. And secondly, I think security practitioners feel like the work that they do there takes a lot of time and a lot of focus, but doesn't necessarily lead to any real reduction in incidents or in risk. And those two things are something we've spent a lot of time kind of looking at and trying to solve. And just on the first point, I think supply chain is actually one of the best domains for new people to the security industry to get trained up in, because essentially you have to learn very quickly at a high level all of the different security principles and domains that you'd have to secure in your own business, and you have to be able to repeat kind of those assessments across multiple other entities, all with different risk profiles. And that's a very, very good way to upskill very quickly across security.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Thank you guys for your thoughts. That's covered a lot of ground there. I always find it fascinating, the kind of that question of it's. I imagine, Hayden, is probably a question for you in your experience of working with clients across the space. Is, are there instances where you could easily throw the kitchen sink at this problem, right, and having hundreds of consultants deployed in, and maybe getting not as many gains as you would potentially require for that kind of investment? Is that a problem? Do you see kind of people kind of overshooting? Is that happen as well?
Massively. So one of the main reasons prospects speak to us is typically because security people tend to want to be secure. And so they're constantly trying to slow procurement processes down and delve into organizations' own security kind of protocols and really understand them. Whereas interestingly, procurement are typically pegged on the rate or speed at which they can bring new suppliers onto their preferred supplier list. And those two differences in objectives ends up with a lot of friction kind of between the two teams. And that's where I think you end up with businesses procuring suppliers without going through security, because they see it as almost a barrier because of that. So yeah, we see that a lot. It's all about collaboration, and being able to turn that around is kind of the key there.
Sure, exactly. Great. Well, speaking of collaboration, let's go back to our audience. So we're going to do another poll question. So fingers on the buzzers, everyone. We're going to follow on from our first question. So we'd like to get your view, having asked the kind of first question around having information. For this poll question, what do you think is the main reason that organizations don't openly share information in this way? Because there's a lot to unpack there as well. So let's have some thoughts on that. So whilst everyone's answering, maybe we'll throw that up to Michael and Hayden. What do you think is your kind of gut reaction to why organizations maybe aren't as forthcoming with this information as perhaps we'd like them to be?
I'll let Michael go first.
Well, I guess the obvious one is the one I already kind of alluded to earlier, that it's being considered a little bit strategic sometimes, the information you have to share, and of course the fact that there are things you might not be doing as well as others expect you to. It becomes, a matter of when is the right time to actually share this information. So I think that is still the most pertinent one, but I also think sometimes it's a matter of not understanding the value of the information that you do share, and I think we have a challenge there, and as security practitioner, I think we have an obligation to try to educate our management and our boards across the boards to actually to see the value in sharing this, and I think the known incidents, when you see companies doing good communication and sharing openly, I think it's way better received by the public and by shareholders, and I think in the end that's important.
Yeah, I'd echo that completely. I think it comes back down to those difference in objectives between the two different types of audience we almost have in the supply chain. So you have your suppliers whose ultimate objective is to increase their revenue and win business, and then we have our clients whose ultimate objective is to reduce risk, and those two things often aren't the same. And so many times, for example, if you're on the supplier side and you've had a massive incident, your sales team might feel like talking about it might prevent a deal from going through, it might slow deals down. And then on the flip side, the suppliers almost have the burden of work here, where if you imagine you're a technology company or any company really with 1,000 clients, every single one of those 1,000 clients maybe wanted to dive into past incidents, into your own security posture. And so there's there's a capacity issue there that means suppliers are on the back foot, which means they try and dodge these reviews. And then also it's the fact that there's that commercial slant that security people, I don't think, often take into account.
Yeah, I'm just having a look whilst you guys are talking at the results coming in. It's super interesting. So we've got kind of a large majority of our listeners are kind of agreeing about minimizing reputational damage, and that makes immediate sense to me. I think what I'm finding interesting is we've almost got 25% people saying other. So perhaps we've got a Q&A board. Perhaps everyone who's out there listening to this, if you're in the other category, we'd love to know why. I mean, I'd certainly be interested. So feel free to ask some questions, to add some thoughts. We've got a whole team working behind the scenes to kind of digest that information. So please add your thoughts, and we can try and come back to them at the end. I'm sure Hayden and Michael will be happy to discuss some others.
The reputation one, just on the reputation point, that's a really interesting one as well, because oftentimes I think people think that disclosing an incident in the supply chain may impact their reputation. But if I think back to all the incidents I've worked on or seen in the news, the worst reputations have come out where people haven't disclosed or investigated an incident in the right way. So typically we find an incident always kind of comes out, especially if there's been a data leakage, because other people can see that that's occurred. And then it comes down to actually, if you didn't announce it at the time, you handled that completely incorrectly. And that's often more damaging than maybe being honest and transparent about what happened and what you did to rectify it.
Brilliant, thank you. So already some great comments coming in. I'm trying to read them and keep a look at some people kind of talking about kind of embarrassment of getting caught. That kind of reputational damage is a real thing. It's a very human thing, right? Kind of that you kind of intersecting a Venn diagram of accountability versus kind of human embarrassment and emotions like that, which is in this kind of world is a real challenge. So it's a really interesting topic. So thanks everyone for taking part in this and adding your thoughts. We'll keep an eye on it, and we've put some time together for Q&A at the end. So perhaps let's come back to it. But I'm keen to move on. Got a couple more questions that I want to pick your brains on, guys, if that's all right with you. So let's move on to the next question, and this is really Hayden, you've already kind of alluded to it slightly, but what does effective supply chain security actually look like? Can you give us some examples from your experience of actual supply chain attacks and maybe the knock-on effects on that in terms of how that either bolster the assurance program, or just let's get into some examples and what does an effective solution look like it?
So before the examples, I think the most effective programs I have seen are where the programs are operating on top of really strong foundational procurement processes. So they understand who their suppliers are, what the suppliers are doing for them, what the inherent risk of those suppliers is before they even go out and start running assurance against them. And then when running assurance, it's quite interesting. I've seen almost two impacts happen from supply chain breaches. So the first is you have a supplier that suffers an attack, and either they can't provide the service that they're providing to you, or they have a breach and lose your data. The other one that people often don't think about, which I think is a lot more interesting, is where you might have, for example, a federated entity such as the government or the NHS, and there may be a supplier there, we'll call them Pineapple, and that supplier may work with multiple different government departments. And if that supplier, for example, fails, it causes like a compound issue to the entire sector or to the entire government. And that's what we call that a systemic or a concentration risk. And the best programs, and something that we work hard on at RiskEdger, is being able to identify not only which suppliers maybe are the least mature when it comes to security, but which suppliers are going to have the biggest effect across the entire sector or ecosystem of companies they work with. And they're the suppliers that we really need to focus on. I'll think up some other examples in the background while Michael's answering.
Yeah, well, I think to the experience part, I've seen companies, of course, and I mean, you opened up with the sourcing issue that you're sourcing your IT services from other companies, and then suddenly you get a knock on the door and you're told that there is signs of intrusions in your company, and you maybe get a hint and you start to hunt, and then at some point you realize that, hey, they actually came in through a sourcing partner which had electronic access to parts of your network, and then they distributed from there, and you were actually the end target. So it was a targeted supply chain attack, which not used like the SolarWinds, a specific application, but used the fact that they were able to find out that there was a supplier that had some form of interaction. So they actually exploited that access path or attack vector. And I especially in the manufacturing world, where you have a lot of IP, you have research departments, I think that's something you need to be on the lookout for when you're selecting your partners. And of course, even though they are strong in security themselves, and you are, there is no guarantee. You still might. I mean, we're only humans, and it's not perfect by any means. But that's one of the experience I've seen on numerous occasions. So I think that's something to pay attention to.
The other aspect of that comes up a lot in conversations with our prospects is a lot of companies I see running supply chain assurance within their procurement process, but they're doing it at a service level or a product level. And personally, I think that's slightly wrong, in that at the procurement level, the question to be answering is this company secure enough for me to feel comfortable working with them? And then you should have a second control at the project level that looks, okay, well, we're now buying this product from this company. Now we need to deploy it internally within this environment with this configuration. And that requires almost a separate process at that project level to be done to look at the assurance over that particular product. And the reason for saying that is I've worked on a number of breaches where an organization has only done service level assurance at the procurement stage. And then they've de-stoked, for example, the corporate network of this supplier and not really looked at any controls there. And then that supplier's gone and had a breach in their corporate network. And then the attackers have moved laterally into their production network, or they had a business email compromise, which is very common. And all of these legitimate email or malicious emails have come from a legitimate email address straight through all of your email filters because you didn't check any kind of email controls. And so separating out those two different kind of like abstract levels of assurance is very important when running an effective supply chain security program.
Yeah, and I think we can actually use that as a jump place for one of the comments as to how can we involve cybersecurity to have a bigger interest into the supply chain security issues. I think one of the things is we could actually just ask them. I think they would be pretty much engaged into any discussion. And also for the procurement people, I think it's important to ask for that help because that gives the company a possibility to actually give a set of procurement basics that they can hand out to any suppliers that are in selection phase and also living up to these security controls. I mean, one of the known issues surrounding manufacturing companies or any OTICS company basically is the fact that they're often sourcing their maintenance of their equipment and their physical processes and equipment to third-party vendors, and they bring their own equipment when they do these upgrades or updates. But there is no control as to how these whatever engineering stations are actually protected or cleaned frequently. So adding that to the procurement that are setting down those SLAs with these vendor companies, that would actually add to the overall supply chain security because you would have better protection on a day-to-day basis also by the vendors coming into your plants and sites.
Interesting on the service level and organization kind of difference in assurance as well. There's an interesting comment saying sharing too much information regarding a business security posture could constitute a threat to the business. Oftentimes I actually heavily disagree with that. Unless you're sharing like a full pen test report with actual operational vulnerabilities in it, there's very little operational data that I could use to attack a company that I wouldn't be able to get from seeing an organization has an ISO 27001 certificate, for example. So this information is already public. So you're not comparing having this information or not having this information. You're comparing having this information from the supplier and fixing the holes, or the supplier still giving that information out pretty much on the public web through certifications and stuff like that, but just not being able to actually see the holes you need to fix. So I think having that sort of, as long as you're not going too far and asking for like really operational data, and that's almost you're ignoring the problem and hoping that reduces your risk instead of really trying to fix it, personally. But I've had a lot of deep discussions about that as well, and I'm not saying I'm right there.
I agree 100% with you.
Yeah, I can imagine. Let's add on. Let's do another poll question quickly because I think that's going to touch on some of the topics that we just talked about there. So I'd be interested to bring everyone into this discussion as well. So the poll question that I'd like to ask is how confident are you in your ability to accurately assess the cybersecurity of organizations in your supply chain? And I think it's quite a deep question, right? Because it's all well and good taking action based off of an assessment, but actually how confident are you in that assessment? And it's certainly a topic that I'd be keen to get the audience's view on, and yours, Hayden, as well, specifically, because I mean this is kind of your bread and butter, right? So what are your thoughts on your, do you believe that organizations have a really good grip and mechanism to assess this, or is it often a lot harder than they perceive?
I think it's very hard, and the reason for that is because if you work in security, you understand how hard it is just to secure your own business, and then often we're asking security teams to repeat that across 1,000 suppliers where they don't even have direct control of the companies they're assessing. And I used to say, and my partners in my previous life didn't really like that, the partners at the big four firms, I used to sit in front of experienced security teams for kind of 3 days on an on-site review in a data center that they'd picked, and there's no way I'm going to find a flaw in 3 days in data that they've handpicked to show me in a data center that they have picked. It seems like a lot of money is being thrown at the problem without any kind of real ability for us to change anything. And that fundamentally is what we've looked to solve with Risk Ledger. It's a difficult problem. And trying to understand which suppliers are vulnerable is, as I said, only half the issue. The other half of the issue is understanding what is the impact when something does go wrong. And I think a lot of programs don't answer that second question at all, and that's something we've spent a lot of time focusing on at Risk Ledger.
Just having a look at some of our responses coming in and some of the questions. Thank you everyone for your questions. We've we're going through them. We've got a couple to tackle at the end, but it's interesting seeing the results. I mean, the good news is no one said they're very confident, so that's always that. So we have a very aware audience, which is fantastic, but a quite an interesting spread from kind of somewhat through to not at all. So yeah, thank you.
It would be interesting asking a question which asked how confident are you in your own company's security, and then comparing that poll with this poll.
Yeah, that would be good, wouldn't it? We'll do it for next time.
Yeah.
Stay tuned, round 2. Thank you, everyone. So I'm conscious that we're 30 minutes in. We've only got 15 minutes left, but I actually really want to ask the next question. So let's move on to the next question, and then we'll jump into a Q&A, because I really want to talk about cloud security. What about the risks related to the cloud services that we are consuming? So what should we be asking about, things like shared responsibility model that CSPs currently use? What are our thoughts on that? Maybe Michael will come to you with your background on this. What are the kind of the questions we need to be thinking about here within the cloud space?
Well, back to the point about, I mean, it needs to be very clearly established which have what responsibility when it comes to incidents or critical events, because at the end of the day, that is what we're going to use and work with as security practitioners. And I think the businesses themselves need to know exactly what they can expect from their cloud provider in terms of support in an event. So I think there's different viewpoints or perspectives here, depending on whether it's before, during, or after an incident. So it's a pretty big question actually. But Hayden, do you have any experience on that?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one, because oftentimes, again, another conversation we have a lot with prospects is when you're talking to an organization who is either a cloud provider or operates a business like a technology company that primarily uses the cloud, they focus their questions again on, for example, like, okay, I'm deployed in your cloud, is my stuff secure? And that's not the threat that you're trying to mitigate here. The threat you're trying to mitigate here is if an attacker attacks AWS, will they be able to breach AWS, not breach my own personal VPC or my own personal environment? That personal environment is up to me to configure and secure. I care more about somebody breaching the actual AWS infrastructure, and then from there being able to do naughty things. And so I think being very clear in your understanding of what threats are you trying to protect against, and then scoping your questions to only ask about the controls that realistically a cloud provider would be responsible for is the key there.
And I think one of the important parts to consider as a company is what kind of data do you want to put in the cloud. So thinking or assuming that you might not be able to protect it as good in the cloud because you are relying on other people doing the right sort of security measures. So do you want to just put everything up there, or is there a certain part of your company data that is actually too important, research data or other stuff that you don't want to have up there? So it also becomes kind of a more business risk kind of consideration more than a cybersecurity consideration, and I think that shows very well how dynamic and complex these setups are, how complex a world we are creating when we are using different providers and we're pulling in data from different sources outside of our own perimeter. It becomes very important to know who's in charge of the master data, and I mean, yeah, lots of perspectives that you can drop here and then go from there.
I don't have any raw data to hand, but qualitatively from the breaches that we have heard from clients, it is far, far, far more likely that an attacker has breached a company's own infrastructure and a company's own deployment within a cloud provider than it is an attacker has actually breached the cloud provider and from there gotten into many companies, something like CloudHopper. That actually tends to be quite a rare attack vector. It's just a lot easier for me, just because of the way cloud infrastructure is configured and the multitude of different configurations and having to have clean code and all of these kind of aspects to it. It's a lot easier for me to breach a company than it is for me to breach a cloud provider. We tend to see that as the main risk. That's slightly different in nation states. Nations, when you're trying to go after someone like, for example, SolarWinds, then it might make more sense to go after actually the cloud provider. But that's completely
And do you
different
think,
threat profile.
Hayden, that we've had some really interesting comments and questions coming in from the audience around this. So, do you think that cloud providers should be held accountable within this kind of space in terms of ensuring patch management, et cetera, et cetera? We've had a couple of questions coming in. Thank you for the audience for that. Do you think there should be a kind of an accountability layer wrapped around that?
They should be accountable for patching their own systems and their own infrastructure that our systems and our infrastructure sits on top of. For patching our systems and our infrastructure, I don't want our cloud providers going anywhere near that, because if they deploy a patch that then ruins my cloud infrastructure, I've lost all of my customers. So again, it's almost like there's two layers of kind of abstraction here. There's the underlying foundational layer, which is what the cloud provider looks after, and then each company builds their own kind of infrastructure on top. And that, I think, is fundamentally what they mean by the shared responsibility model. They should be accountable and they should be doing that foundational stuff correctly. But then at the end of the day, if you've spun up a virtual machine on a cloud provider and you haven't patched it, it's not the cloud provider's responsibility, or they shouldn't be accountable for going after you for that.
Absolutely. No, that's a good point. So we've got a couple of questions coming in. So let's do a bit of Q&A as we wrap up, and then I've got a final poll question as well. So I'm going to ask some really good questions coming in. Thank you, everyone. So here's one from Andra. So is it a good strategy to run automated real-time threat intel on the supply chain and investigate suspicious alerts manually? What do we think about that?
So we don't do any kind of threat intel or vulnerability scans for supply chains. There are many tools like BitSight that do. In a perfect world, I think that actually would be a reasonable strategy to run. In practical terms, it never really works, and there's a couple of reasons for that. So firstly, in terms of threat intelligence and particularly running domain scans and trying to scan public IP infrastructure of suppliers, I have never seen a provider be able to give you anywhere near the accuracy that you need to be able to run a program like that effectively. So oftentimes they try and basically use TLS logs to find out the IP addresses of suppliers. They'll end up scanning the wrong thing. Your team get inundated with false positives, false negatives. You think a supplier is horrendously insecure, but it turns out they've scanned the completely wrong assets. And so the way we advise clients to do this is basically to like layer up their solutions. So I think at the core, you can't get away from running a proper assurance program where you're going to a company and trying to find out across physical security, across IT operations, across software development, you're trying to find out actually what controls do they have in place. And then secondly, if you want to supplement that information with some sort of external data, like a threat intelligence feed or like a scanning tool, that is the way we recommend clients set up their programs. And there are now tools like ours, for example, RiskLedger. The way we work is instead of like static assessments, the idea is you connect with the company and they almost use our platform to help manage and govern their security. And so it actually turns that inside out view into a much more dynamic and continuous way or continuous feed of information that you can then feed off of to find out actually what's going on across the entire security program within that company. It's in an ideal world that would be perfect, just external data showing you where to look, which is practically, I don't know if anyone in the audience would disagree with that, but practically I've never seen a program like that work at all.
Yeah, thanks, Aidan. I've got one more question that I'd like to ask from Nicholas, who's asked a couple of really interesting questions. So thank you, Nicholas, out there. So the one I want to ask is, often when you ask for information, you receive the reply business confidential, regardless that you have the clause giving you the right to do so. So from my perspective, it isn't that easy to do assessments in depth. Do you have a suggestion on how to deal with this?
Yeah, so we see that a lot, particularly in manual programs. And funnily enough, that's a symptom. And being on the supplier side in the previous job, that is a tactic they use to try and dodge reviews when they can. And it's a symptom of, you have to imagine some of these suppliers will have 10,000 clients and they'll have 10,000 people asking a bunch of questions. And for the sales team, anything that slows down a deal will kill a deal. And so for them, the security team has to do everything they can to try and dodge these reviews. So that's a classic tactic to try and dodge these reviews. Fundamentally, that's why we built RiskLedger. The idea is the supplier can do it once and all of their clients can feed off of that one pot of information. So it removes that capacity problem and allows them then to open up a little bit more without being flooded with further questions. But yeah, in terms of dealing with that, the only way you really can deal with that is one of twofold. You can either turn to the business and honestly say, we have not been able to assess this supplier in any real depth, therefore this is the risk, it's up to you to work with them or not, and really try and change the way you describe that risk to the business. Or secondly, getting the businesses and typically the board and the procurement teams buy-in that says unless a supplier can meet the level of data that you require for you to be able to make a judgment, they will not procure from them. And some of the best assurance programs I've worked on are where security's gone to a supplier and said, can we have that data? The supplier said no, and then procurement picks up the phone and says, well, we're not buying from you then. Puts the phone down, and within 10 minutes, that data's been sent through to security. And not having that buy-in is difficult.
And I'm gonna jump in as well on that, Hayden. It's really interesting you said that, because we have one more poll question which I really want to ask. I find it very interesting with kind of what you said about the commercial angle. So we're going to put up a final poll question which I hope will generate some really interesting questions. So in your experience, listeners, how likely is it that a contract will be signed with a new vendor before a supply chain risk assessment is performed? That kind of touches on what you were just saying, right? It kind of deals with, let's spend a year assessing all of our supply chain. Oh, there's a deal on the table. Let's tick the box, right? So let's get some thoughts from the audience on this, because I find it's just an absolutely fascinating predicament. So guys on the call, Hayden and Michael, have you had experience with this? Have you got a gut feel? Does this happen?
I'll let Michael go first in the operational space.
Yeah, well, I mean, it comes back to how good is procurement to put in those requirements or demands for what the supplier had to deliver in case of anything. So which type of answers? Because let's face it, there's also a little excuse on the supply side is that it's a matter of supply and demand, and if we are not demanding that they need to work with other things that the standard, performance KPIs and metrics that we are normally seeing in contracts and normally evaluating, because it's a matter of price tag at the end of the day. If we're not seeing these additional security requirements that they have to deliver to a certain level information, then it becomes difficult. And I think then the challenge is, how do you then in your audit turn the question around, not asking for what can you tell us about your incidents, but asking them, in the case that this kind of exploit happened, what would you be able to deliver of valuable information that our SOC could work with? I mean, try to put pressure on the supplier, and then evaluating their hunger to actually work with you, and then let that be the guidance for selecting any supplier that you have to include in your supply chain. I think that's.
Yeah, I'd echo all of that. Interestingly, I do get a lot of heat from speaking to prospects on this answer, but often I say many times, if a business is buying a supplier, let's say that supplier is about to do something that triples your business's revenue, and if they don't buy that supplier, your business is going to go under. That is a bigger risk to the board than them working with a supplier that's insecure. So security risk, while it is a big risk and it's often top of mind for all of us as security professionals, as a CEO or as a board, it may not be the top risk for them at that time. And so oftentimes you have to take that context into account. Otherwise, then the other thing to kind of bear in mind there is the board and the business's buy-in. If you're running an assurance program without any buy-in from procurement, the business and the board, that will happen a lot more often than if you do have their buy-in and they're supporting running the program. Otherwise, everything that Michael said was pretty much spot on.
And we're getting some really good engagement on the poll as well. I think everyone's kind of agreeing that it definitely happens. And I think it's just interesting to hear your perspective on that, Hayden, in terms of putting the wider kind of strategy in place, because that's a good point. Actually, I hadn't thought about that. I kind of thought, well, a deal's a deal, but actually, what is the impact downstream in terms of bigger risk? So it just feels like levels of risk abstraction, doesn't it?
If that's happening a lot, the two things I would do would, one, reassess the board buy-in and maybe the stakeholder buy-in that you have. And number two, maybe look at your process again, because oftentimes the other reason that happens is because your risk process is taking too long or is too clunky, and the business see it as a barrier rather than an enabler. And that's where we win clients, for example. They come to us wanting to speed that process up so that they can really kind of get that business buy-in off the back of it.
Brilliant. Well, gents, thank you so much for your time. We are out of time. It's flown by. It's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you very much for joining us, Hayden and Michael. Thank you to the audience for listening in and joining us and asking some really interesting questions and taking part in our polls. Before we go, we'd just like to say that, you know, this is part of a series that we're doing, so please come back next week and tune in. We're going to be talking again about supply chain, but some more specifics on how to address vulnerabilities. We have a report on our kind of supply chain insurance work at with Secure, which the URL is on the screen. And also, if you are looking to learn a little bit more about Risk Ledger, there is the URL to go and understand a bit more about what Hayden's been talking about as well. So any final last comments, gents?
Not at all. Perhaps say, yeah, thanks for running the webinar. If anyone wants to connect with me on LinkedIn, feel free. But yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I'm also good. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely day. We're going to sign out, but thanks all for your time and see you at the next one.